He had lost his fortune on a horse race the year before. He had crossed an ocean and half a continent to stand on this exact piece of ground. He looked east across the grass, and he believed every word of it. His name was Moreton Frewen. The year was 1879, and the country he had just ridden into was about to make him, ruin him, and bury better men than him under 6 feet of snow. How sure would you have to be to bet everything you had left on a country you'd seen for one summer? Would you have seen what was missing? This is the story of the Powder River cattle boom, and what it actually cost. Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives, where the real history of the frontier is told one verified story at a time. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered the way they actually happened, subscribe and ride with us. In the comments, tell us, would you have bet your fortune on a country you had seen for only one summer? To understand what happened on the Powder River, you have to understand what kind of country it was and what kind of system was about to be turned loose on it. The Powder River Basin lies in the northeastern corner of Wyoming. It stretches from the eastern face of the Bighorn Mountains in the west, across the rolling plains to the Black Hills on the South Dakota border. Inside that basin run the drainages of the Powder, the Tongue, the Little Missouri, the Belle Fourche, and the Cheyenne, tributaries of the Yellowstone and the Missouri. It is high country. It is dry country. The winters there can break the back of any living thing that does not know exactly how to survive them. And for 10,000 years, the creatures that lived there did know how. Tens of millions of plains, bison once roamed between Alberta and Florida, and the Powder River grass was part of what fattened them. Archaeologists working an arroyo trap at the Hawkins site south of Sundance unearthed enormous bison bones dated to more than 6,000 years ago. At the Vore Buffalo Jump east of Sundance, the bones of tens of thousands of animals lie heaped where they died over the span of centuries. This was Crow country first. In the 18th century, the Crow Nation held the Bighorns and the lands east of them. Then, around the turn of the 19th century, the Oglala and Brule Lakota came west out of Minnesota. The Minneconjou, the Hunkpapa, and the Sans Arc followed in the 1820s, around the same time that the bison were being driven to extinction east of the Mississippi. The Lakota were formidable warriors and excellent horse riders. The Crow were stealthy and famous horse thieves. The two nations fought over the Powder River country for decades, with the Crow holding mostly to the Bighorns and the Lakota controlling the plains. The Cheyenne and the Arapaho, allies of the Lakota, hunted in the southeast. White men came and mostly left again. In 1808, the fur trapper Edward Rose, of mixed Cherokee, African, and European descent, came up into what is now southern Montana and lived for several years with the Crow. In 1811, he guided Wilson Price Hunt and the overland party of the Astor expedition south along the face of the Bighorns to Clear Creek and the headwaters of the Powder. In 1834, Antonio Mateo built the Portuguese houses, a set of trading post cabins on the banks of the Powder near present-day Sussex, Wyoming. Jim Bridger and his trappers eventually pushed him out. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 set aside land for the Crow Nation west of the Powder and the Lakota Nation to the east. For years afterward, this country was largely unvisited by white people. It was not until 1859 that Captain W.F. Reynolds of the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers made the first real survey of the region, and he described what he saw in uncomplimentary terms. Then, in 1863, a man named John Bozeman laid out a trail up the east side of the Bighorns. The gold strikes in Montana had pulled prospectors north, and the Bozeman Trail was the shortcut. It also ran straight through the best hunting grounds the Lakota had left. In 1866, Red Cloud and Crazy Horse went to war over it. They burned the forts the Army built along that road. And under the Second Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868, the whole northeastern corner of what is now Wyoming was granted to the tribes. The Army marched away. The tribes burned the hated forts to the ground. For a few years, things were quiet. Then everything changed. In 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills and announced the discovery of gold. The 1868 treaty was a dead letter the moment that news reached the East. By the summer of 1876, 3 columns of U.S. troops were converging on the Powder River country, looking for the Lakota and Cheyenne, who had refused to go to the reservations. That campaign ended in Montana. Crooks claimed victory on the Rosebud, and Custer's annihilation on the Little Bighorn. A peace commission afterward took the Powder River country back from the Lakota by signature. Crazy Horse surrendered the following spring and was killed by a soldier's bayonet a few months later. Dull Knife and the Northern Cheyennes were exiled to Indian Territory. In 1878, the Army renamed its supply base at the old Bozeman Trail crossing of the Powder. It moved the post to a site on Clear Creek and called it Fort McKinney. The town of Buffalo grew up beside it, and with the soldiers came the cattlemen. By 1883, only about 100 bison were left on the northern plains, with another 200 protected in Yellowstone National Park. The grass that had fed those tens of millions of bison was still there. It was still, as one Cheyenne newspaper editor had put it back in 1867, exceedingly nutritious, and it was, for all practical purposes, free. That was the catch. That was the entire boom in one sentence. The grass was free. The system that came rolling north to eat that grass was not invented in Wyoming. It was the Texas system of ranching, and it had been brewing for centuries, picking up bits of itself in the Greater Antilles, in coastal Carolina, in Tamaulipas in Mexico, and finally in the subtropical lowlands of Texas. The historian Terry Jordan identified its essential trait. It was the subtropical practice of allowing cattle to care for themselves year-round in stationary pastures on free range without supplementary feeding or protection. The humid prairies, cane brakes, and salt marshes of coastal Texas were even better suited to this careless system than the marshes of Andalusia had been. The herds did not just survive on neglect, they fattened on it. That was the theory. That was the assumption the whole industry rested on. In Texas, it worked. In Wyoming, it was about to be tested against winters that no one in this system had ever seen. The Civil War cracked open the conditions for what came next. The war centralized the beef-packing industry in Cincinnati and Chicago, where disassembly plants slaughtered, butchered, and canned meat on a scale that could feed a nation. The same war left somewhere around 5 million Texas Longhorns roaming untended after the young cowboys went off to fight for the Confederacy. By 1867, the Department of Agriculture reported that a 3-year-old steer in Massachusetts sold for $86. The same animal in Texas, leaner and unwanted, went for $9.46. The cattle buyer Joseph McCoy said of that era that a man's poverty in Texas was estimated by the number of cattle he possessed. The railroads finished the picture. The first car of chilled beef left Chicago for the East in 1857. By the late 1870s, the refrigerated rail car was working well enough to transform the trade. In 1876, England imported only 1,732 tons of fresh beef. 2 years later, the figure exceeded 30,000 tons, with roughly 80% of it coming from the United States. The federal government, meanwhile, having starved the Plains tribes off their lands, was buying cattle by the thousands to feed them on reservations. In 1878 alone, the Indian Bureau bought 11,311 head of cattle for distribution to Western tribes. Demand on both sides of the Atlantic, free grass on the northern plains, idle Texas herds, and a railroad that could carry beef to the markets faster than a steer could spoil. That was the bubble forming. By 1870, 40,000 cattle had come into southeastern Wyoming territory from Texas. By 1871, an estimated 60,000 grazed within 100 miles of Cheyenne, and the Interocean Hotel bar was filling up with Chicago packing house representatives in tailored suits. In 1872, the cattlemen organized themselves into what would become one of the most powerful political organizations in the West, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. By 1880, the Cheyenne Club had opened its doors under a mansard roof, and oysters were being shucked, wine was flowing, and as one cattle owner wrote, cordial drunks abounded. Cheyenne in 1880 reportedly had 8 millionaires among its 3,000 residents, one in every 375. The town built itself an opera house in 1882 and put up electric streetlights. One of the first cities in the country to do so. And meanwhile, beyond the railhead, beyond the federal forts, beyond every certainty the boomers were drinking to in Cheyenne, lay the Powder River. Empty of bison, empty of Lakota, full of grass, a whole country waiting. What followed was one of the largest, fastest, most reckless economic stampedes the American West had ever seen. The grass would be eaten, the book counts would be cooked, the British would arrive with checkbooks, the investors would arrive with railroad timetables. The cowboys would arrive on horseback, the homesteaders would arrive on wagon seats with everything they owned tied to the back. And after 8 years of unprecedented profits and unimaginable greed, the country would deliver its answer in the form of a winter. The first cattle to come into the Powder River country came up the trails from Texas, and they came because the southern ranges were already starting to crowd. By the mid-1870s, every cow that could be driven north was being driven somewhere. The Goodnight-loving Trail had been pushing herds out of Texas for nearly a decade. The Chisholm Trail was carrying them to the Kansas railheads. And further north, beyond Kansas, beyond Nebraska, beyond the railhead at Cheyenne, lay this enormous country that the soldiers and the surveyors said was empty. Empty. That was the word the cattlemen used. Empty meant the bison were gone. Empty meant the Lakota and the Cheyenne had been pushed onto reservations. Empty meant that nobody who could stop a man from grazing his cattle was anywhere in sight. In the late 1870s, the first big outfits began to spread north out of the original ranching toeholds around Cheyenne and Laramie. John Wesley Iliff had been running cattle south of Cheyenne since 1867, supplying the Union Pacific construction crews and the local Sioux tribes. The Lathrams, the Doles, and a handful of others had built fortunes off the wholesale price of cattle in May 1870, when an 850-pound steer that cost $1.50 to raise sold at $6.47 per hundredweight, $55 on the hoof. The math, as one Scottish-born ranch manager named John Clay would later put it, was pretty compelling. A steer that cost $1.50 to put on free grass could sell for $23 during an unheated market. At the peak, it sold for more than $60 per head. Net profit during good times, $40 a head. The cattle were free. The grass was free. The water was free. The only cost was the cowboy wages and the trail drive. Stockmen fanned out across Wyoming territory. They staked out ranches in the Bighorn Basin, in the upper Green River Valley, and, most ambitiously of all, in the Powder River Basin. They began in 1876, the same year of the Little Bighorn. They came in earnest after 1878, when Fort McKinney went up on Clear Creek, and Buffalo, Wyoming, began to grow. And in 1878, in what would soon become Johnson County, in the country below where the forks of the Powder River joined, two brothers from England rode in and chose a spot. Their names were Richard and Moreton Frewen. They were the two younger sons of an Anglo-Irish landed gentry family. Moreton had been born in Sussex, but the family spent much of its time in Ireland. He had been educated at Eton and at Cambridge. He was tall, handsome, and the kind of man who could spend money faster than the printing presses could make it. He came to America after losing a substantial bet on a horse race in England, on the Doncaster Cup, with only 2 horses in the race. He bet on the wrong one. His brother Richard had been hunting in the American West for several years before they decided to go into the cattle business together. The plan came together after they visited John Adair and Charles Goodnight's enormous J.A. Ranch in the Texas Panhandle, then paused in Estes Park to call on the Earl of Dunraven, then headed north into Wyoming. Moreton was reportedly impressed by the size of the Wyoming buffalo herds, which were larger than what he had seen on the J.A. The Frewens had advice from General Philip Sheridan to settle along the Powder River. They followed it. After what was by all accounts a dangerous trek from Fort Washakie, they arrived in April 1879 on the land they would claim. They built a log cabin. Eventually, they would replace it with something far more elaborate. It was called Frewen's Castle. The hardwood floors and the rosewood staircase with walnut railings were shipped from England. It cost Moreton around $900 a month to run, and it was built on borrowed money. The cowboys had a different name for it. They called it the Bighorn Ranch. Sometimes they just called it Castle Frewen. It sat on an outcrop overlooking a tributary of the Powder, and its primary purpose was not to be a working ranch headquarters. It was to entertain English guests and potential investors. Sir Samuel and Lady Baker, the first Europeans to visit Lake Albert in Central Africa, came to call. So did everyone else Moreton could convince to make the journey. The herd was started with 4,500 head, bought from the ranch whose brand the Frewens would adopt as their own. They took the 76 brand, and that is what their outfit became known as. The 76 outfit, the 76 ranch. In the early years, the boom mathematics worked exactly as the Cheyenne newspapers had promised they would. Grass in Wyoming, the Cheyenne Daily Leader's editor Nathan Baker had spelled out on May 1, 1867, was abundant and exceedingly nutritious. Good water was everywhere. Mild winters required no feeding. An operator might expect winter losses of 2 to 3% of his herd, but this was still cheaper than buying hay. And the railroad, despite what some cattlemen muttered about Union Pacific freight rates, provided cheap transportation to markets in the east. By 1882, the 6 counties of Wyoming reported 476,274 cattle on their tax rolls, worth nearly $7 million. And because cattlemen were known for underestimating their herds for tax purposes, the real number on the range may have been twice that. The Frewens' herd grew, on paper, at a remarkable rate. By the peak, it would reportedly include 4,500 head, plus 10 times that number again, 9,000 sheep, and 450 horses. Estimates of the size of the Frewen herds vary wildly, from 45,000 on the low end to as high as 80,000. That spread is itself a clue to what was actually going on. Nobody really knew how many cattle were out there. Nobody could really know. The cattle were turned loose on the open range, unfenced, unwatched, unherded, unfed, and untended except at the spring and fall roundups. They ranged where they would, mingled with the cattle of other outfits, drifted in storms, were stolen, were lost, were eaten by wolves, were eaten by men. The herds were highly mobile, As one Wyoming ranch manager wrote, the actual census changed by the hour or the minute, so the herds were counted on what was called book count. The owner kept his tally in a ledger or in his head. He adjusted it periodically for births and deaths, for shipments and sales, using guesses that seemed reasonable given the severity of the winter or the lushness of the grass. The numbers looked precise. They were not. At best, they were guesses. At worst, they were intentionally deceptive. W. E. Guthrie, who arrived in Wyoming in 1878, later wrote that the practice of relying on book count was already a well-established custom when he got there. In retrospect, he observed, the fact that businessmen would lose sight of ordinary business methods so completely that they would buy and sell cattle without counting a single cow, with no way of ascertaining how many cattle they were paying for except the seller's tally books, was almost beyond belief. But that is what they did. In 1883, the purchasing agent for the huge Swan Land and Cattle Company put it this way: if the numbers on the range were within 2,000 or 3,000 of the book count, he considered the whole purchase a very fortunate one. John Clay, the Scotsman whose job it would later be to verify cattle numbers on behalf of British investors, wrote bluntly in his autobiography that everybody in the ranch business knew that all the herds of cattle were notoriously short. Many of them, he said, were running 50% less in actual numbers than the book count. 50%, half. The investors back in London and Edinburgh and Boston and New York believed they owned twice as many cattle as actually existed. The whole industry was, on paper, larger than it really was. On grass, it was about to become much larger than the range could carry. Into that fiction came outside capital, and a great deal of it. Wholesale prices for cattle had stayed high enough through the late 1870s to keep enticing investors. In March 1881, wholesale prices per hundredweight passed $5 and kept climbing. In June 1882, the Chicago packing houses were paying more than $7 per hundredweight, or more than $60 per cow. That attracted more capital. Prominent historian of the American West, W. Turrentine Jackson, later estimated that British interests alone invested more than $45 million in American cattle in the 1880s. Between 1880 and 1900, 181 livestock companies incorporated in Wyoming with a combined capitalization of $94,095,800. Harper's Magazine published a scintillating article in November 1879 detailing a theoretical 3-year profit schedule for a southern Colorado cattle ranch, beginning with a herd of 4,000. By the 3rd year, the magazine claimed, the owner would be clearing $114,615 in profits. That is roughly $2.5 million in today's money. And in 1885, the Baron Walter von Richthofen, a German nobleman who had moved from Silesia to Denver in 1877, published a book called Cattle Raising on the Plains of North America. In it, he predicted that cattlemen could count on profits of 156% over a 5-year period. In what may be among the most optimistic words ever to flow from a speculator's pen, the Baron wrote, and this is a direct quotation, "There is not the slightest amount of uncertainty in cattle raising." The historian Helena Huntington Smith later called what happened next the beef bubble. By 1885, when von Richthofen was writing those words, the bubble had already popped. People just did not know it yet. The first sign that the system was running into the wall was that the small operators were starting to be squeezed out. The Cheyenne Daily Leader, quoting the Drover's Journal, observed in 1882 that slowly but surely the choice range locations were being bought up by what it called the whales of the Western cattle business, and that those whales were fencing the small fry away from the best water supplies. Every week or so, the paper noted, some startlingly large sale was reported to one or more of the gigantic livestock corporations operating in the ranching regions. The next year, the leader reported the growing alarm in Wyoming. In Wyoming, the paper said, men of moderate means who were in the cattle-raising business or who contemplated entering it were looking with concern upon the actions of the great companies that were buying the large herds of the territory. What, they asked, would be the result of the practical monopoly of the business by the companies? What chance could a poor man have for success in ranging cattle with the vast herds? A month later, the paper went further. It will not be long, the editorialist wrote, before all the cattle which roam over the prairies of the West will be owned by great corporations. The price of beef will then be whatever the caprice of the monopolists may want to make it. That was the political problem coming. It was a problem that would, within 10 years, get men killed. But before the politics caught fire, the Frewens needed money. By 1882, the 76 ranch was deep in debt. Castle Frewen was expensive. Moreton's cattle counts were generous on paper and shaky on the ground. The brothers had begun to drift apart in their views on the business. So in 1882, Moreton went home to England seeking investors. He raised what was reported as roughly $1.5 million in capital, and with it, he reorganized the 76 Ranch as a joint stock company. He called it the Powder River Cattle Company, Limited. It was registered under English law. Its shareholders were largely English. To sweeten the pot, Moreton agreed to take no salary as manager. He would be compensated by a share of the profits only after the preferred shareholders had received their cut. He returned to Wyoming as the manager of an English company, spending English money to buy and run an enormous American herd. The 76 Ranch was supplanted by the new company. Moreton stayed on as manager. Richard, his older brother, was effectively bought out. Their foreman, Fred G.S. Hesse, an Englishman who had come to the United States in 1873, then to Cheyenne from Texas in 1876 with a herd belonging to the Frewens, stayed on. In 1884, Hesse would file his own homestead and establish his own outfit, the 28 Ranch, on Crazy Woman Creek near Buffalo, while still remaining foreman of the 76. This pattern, Englishmen and Scotsmen pouring money into Wyoming cattle with foremen and managers on the ground who had been seasoned for only a few seasons themselves, was about to become the dominant pattern of the Powder River Basin. By 1885, more than 20 cattle companies were operating in the Powder River country, with a combined value of around $12 million. The Powder River Cattle Company alone may have owned more than 50,000 cows. Two-thirds of the 181,000 cattle counted at the 1884 Powder River Roundup were estimated, by the homesteader Jack Flagg, to be English-owned. The first roundup in Wyoming back in 1874 had required only 2 divisions. By 1884, there were no fewer than 31 divisions, and the roundup system had become law in the territory. In one division alone, 200 cowboys with 2,000 horses worked 400,000 cattle over a 6-week period. Representatives from other divisions visited to retrieve cattle that may have strayed. Pre-rodeo, 3 good ropers could brand 166 cows in 80 minutes. This was an industry. It was a system. It looked from the Inter-Ocean Hotel bar in Cheyenne and from the shareholder meetings in London like the closest thing to a sure bet that the American West had ever offered. Out on the range, riding through it, a man named Horace Plunkett, a member of the Anglo-Irish gentry, a partner of Moreton Frewen's, and a sharp observer, was already writing something else in his diary. Of Moreton's business sense, he said, "This is the worst man of business I know." Of his recklessness with money, Plunkett wrote that he was afraid Moreton's unstable energy would, in Plunkett's phrase, upset the coaches. Plunkett was right. He just did not yet know how completely right he was, because what was about to come for the Powder River Cattle Company and for every other outfit grazing the Powder River country was not a slow correction. It was not a market dip. It was not a tax adjustment. It was the wind and the snow and the country itself finally deciding to have its say. But step back from Moreton Frewen for a moment and look at the whole basin in the early 1880s, because the Frewens were not the only ones doing this. The Frewens were just the loudest, the most publicized, and in some ways the most theatrical example of a much larger phenomenon. Other ranches grew up alongside the 76. The Powder River Cattle Company's range bumped up against the spreads of other big outfits. To the south, the Seawright brothers built the headquarters of the enormous Goose Egg Ranch near Red Buttes, west of what is now Casper, in 1883. Their cattle ranged from the Bridger Trail on the west to the Powder River on the north, from Coal Creek on the east to the North Platte River on the south. Try to picture that range on a modern map. It is most of central Wyoming. One man recalled later that the 101 ranch near Moorcroft had its cattle spread all over the basin, and that roundup crews frequently found their stock scattered from Edgemont, South Dakota, to Sheridan, Wyoming. That is about 240 miles. Monsieur de Ricles, one of the early Powder River cattle operators, recalled later that the basin was steer country. Thousands upon thousands of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico 2-year-old steers were turned loose there to run on the open range for 2 or more years and were then marketed largely at Chicago as fat range cattle. The cattle did not know any borders. The cowboys did not put up any borders. There were no borders worth mentioning. The land belonged on paper to the federal government as part of the unimproved public domain. In practice, it was occupied by whoever could put cows on it. The cowboys who worked these ranges were a mixed lot. They came up from Texas with the herds and stayed because the wages were a little better and the country was new. They drifted in from the played-out mining camps of Colorado and Montana. They came west out of Nebraska and Kansas looking for work. They were white and black and Mexican and native. The cattle industry, despite the way it was later mythologized, was always more diverse than the dime novels admitted. They lived in line shacks and bunkhouses, and sometimes in nothing more than a saddle blanket thrown down by a fire. They worked 12 and 15 and 18 hours a day during Roundup. They were paid roughly $30 to $40 a month plus food. They were expected to ride out at any hour and in any weather, to bring back the cattle if the cattle had drifted, to brand if it was branding time, to shoot wolves and grizzlies and mountain lions if those came around the calves, and to keep their mouths shut around the owner's friends from England. The Roundup was the only part of the business that was carefully organized. Everything else was guesswork. In the spring, the cowboys would gather along the headwaters of the streams and work their way downstream, branding calves and cutting out beeves bound for shipment. In the fall, they would do it again. The camps moved constantly. The cooks worked over open fires. The chuck wagon was the moving capital of the cowboys' world. And around every roundup, there was the constant low-grade tension that someone, somewhere, was rebranding a calf that did not belong to him. That tension would, in time, become the spark for everything that came next. Because while the British capital was pouring in and the cowboys were working the herds and the book counts were inflating to satisfy investors in Edinburgh, another kind of person was beginning to come into the Powder River Basin, too. They were coming in 2s and 3s. They were not English. They were not investors. They were Americans, mostly, and they were coming with land claims in their pockets. The Homestead Act of 1862 had allowed any citizen or any immigrant willing to declare his intent to become a citizen to claim 160 acres of public land. The terms were not generous, but they were achievable. You had to live on the land for 5 years. You had to make improvements, build a house, plant trees, dig a well, fence in some part of it. After 5 years, if you had made it, the title was yours. The Timber Culture Act of 1872 and the Desert Land Act of 1877 added more ways to claim land, sometimes in larger parcels, if you would plant trees or bring water to dry country. In 1884 alone, more people filed for land claims in Wyoming than in the previous 14 years combined. In the eyes of the homesteaders, this was the deal that the federal government had made with ordinary Americans. The land was supposed to be available to anyone who would work it. In the eyes of the big cattlemen, including Moreton Frewen, including the Swans, including the corporate boards in London and Edinburgh and New York, those homesteaders were a different word entirely. To the cattlemen, the homesteaders were nesters. They were squatters who fenced off the water. They were small-time cowboys who took up land claims along the creek bottoms and ran a handful of their own cattle on what the big outfits had claimed as their range. Some of them, the cattlemen said, were thieves. Some of them, the cattlemen said, were rustlers. Some of them, the cattlemen said, branded mavericks, unbranded calves, under their own irons, rather than letting them go, as custom dictated, to whichever big outfit's cow had borne them. Some of them probably were rustlers. Most of them were not. Most of them were doing exactly what the federal government had told them they had a right to do. Staking 160 acres, building a cabin, running a few head of cattle, and trying to make a life out of a country that, 20 years earlier, had been Lakota hunting ground. The two sides did not understand each other at all. The cattlemen, who controlled the courts and the territorial legislature through the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, saw the homesteaders as a threat to a system that was already overextended. The homesteaders saw the cattlemen as foreigners with foreign accents, trying to keep American citizens off American land that was, by federal law, supposed to be open to them. Both sides were partly right. Both sides were about to discover that being partly right is not enough when the wind comes down off the bighorns and the temperatures fall towards 60 below. Because that, the weather, was the thing the entire system had refused to plan for. And it was coming. There is one more thing worth saying about the boom years before the country turned on it, and that is what life actually felt like on the ground for the people doing the work. A cowboy on the Powder River in 1883 woke before dawn. He rolled out of a bunkhouse bed, or out of a saddle blanket on the ground if he was on roundup, and he went to work in whatever weather the country had decided to give him that day. The line shacks the cowboys lived in during the winter were not luxury accommodations. They were one-room cabins, sometimes built of logs and sometimes of sod, almost always heated by a single stove that burned whatever wood or buffalo chips the cowboy had been able to gather before the snow came. He was alone for weeks at a time. He was paid roughly $40 when he came in offline for the season, and he often spent most of it in a single bad weekend in Buffalo or Cheyenne. The owners did not live this way. The owners, the Frewens, the Swans, the men of the Cheyenne Club, lived in mansions and shipped their hardwood floors from England. Their visits to the ranches were occasions. They came in private rail cars. They were taken on hunting parties up into the bighorns, where the buffalo had been replaced by elk. The gap between the cowboys' world and the owners' world was the deepest social fact of the boom. It was a gap the cattle barons did not see, and the cowboys did. The system worked, for a while, only because the country was so big and the grass was so abundant that the inequities did not pinch. When the grass ran short, every relationship in the system pinched at once. The homesteader changed the equation in a particular way that the cattleman did not at first appreciate. The homesteader was not a hired hand. He was, in his own eyes, an independent owner of a small piece of America, doing exactly what the federal government had invited him to do. When a baron's herd drifted across a homesteader's claim, the homesteader did not have to take orders from anybody. This is what the cattle barons could not abide. By the summer of 1885, the Powder River grass was thinning. Wyoming historian T.A. Larson would later estimate that by 1886 there were 1.5 million cattle on the Wyoming range. That is roughly the same number of cattle that Wyoming has today, but it was spread across a country whose carrying capacity was nowhere close to what the cattlemen had been told to believe. Two-thirds of those cattle, in the Powder River Roundup of 1884 at least, were owned by English investors who had never set foot on the range and who were operating off book counts that everyone in the business knew were inflated. The other third belonged to American outfits, to small homesteaders, and to the wandering, untraceable strays of 2 decades of careless trail driving. The grass was being eaten faster than it could grow back. A second problem stacked on top of the first. Prices for cattle had begun to slip in late 1884. The packing houses in Chicago, which had been paying more than $7 per hundredweight just 2 years before, were paying less and less. Ranchers held on to their cattle, hoping prices would rise the next year. That meant they did not ship. That meant the herds stayed on the range longer than they should have. That meant more cows eating less grass. A third problem stacked on top of the first two. Sheep started coming into the Wyoming range in serious numbers in the mid-1880s. Sheep ate grass closer to the root than cattle did, and the cattlemen, many of them Texas men who had brought with them the Texas system's abiding hostility to mixing sheep with cattle, hated sheep with a religious fervor. But the sheep came anyway, because the range was supposedly open and because wool prices were strong. And then came the weather. In Texas, the drought had begun in the summer of 1884. It crept north, year by year, drying out the ranges as it came. By the summer of 1886, eastern Wyoming and Montana were experiencing the driest weather anyone alive could remember. By September of that year, some parts of Montana had received just 2 inches of rain for the entire summer. The grass that the cattle needed to put on weight for the winter was sparse and short. The grass that they needed to bend over and find under snow in January and February was, in many places, already gone. In his annual report for 1886, the commander of Fort McKinney near Buffalo wrote a sentence that, looking back, reads like a death notice. "The country," he wrote, "is full of Texas cattle, and there is not a blade of grass within 15 miles of the post. 15 miles, no grass, and winter coming." The beef bubble popped that fall. By November 1886, wholesale cattle prices in Chicago had fallen to $3.16 per hundredweight. That was less than half of what they had been in 1884. The cattle that the English companies thought they owned, the cattle that the book counts said were out there, the cattle that were supposed to be worth $60 a head, those cattle were now worth less than $30, and the market was still falling. Investors in London were beginning to ask hard questions. Moreton Frewen, who had been running the Powder River Cattle Company for 4 years on the strength of his charm and his connections and his promises of profit, had no answers his shareholders wanted to hear. By the spring of 1886, the shareholders had had enough. They voted Moreton out. He was replaced as manager. The cowboys around Cheyenne and Buffalo had a new name for him by then. They called him Mortal Ruin. He went home to England. What he left behind on the range was a herd of cattle that had gone into the autumn of 1886, already weakened. They had been grazing too long on too little. The drought had cut their winter fat. They were, in the language of the stockmen, in poor flesh. Even a normal winter would have hit them hard. The winter that came was not a normal winter. It began in November. Snow came early and it stayed. By January, the storms had piled drifts so deep that cattle could not paw down through the crust to reach what little grass remained. The temperatures dropped and stayed dropped. On January 14th, 1887, the thermometer in Miles City, Montana, bottomed out at 60 degrees below zero. 60 below. At that temperature, exposed flesh freezes in minutes. Water that is not actively boiling freezes solid. The cattle, weakened by drought, with no fat to burn, with no grass to find, with no shelter to crowd into, began to die. They died standing. They died walking. They died trying to peel bark off the cottonwoods along the creek bottoms because there was nothing else left for them to eat. Riders who went out later to count the losses said that you could follow the trails of the dead by walking along the streams, finding the trunks of cottonwoods stripped bare to the height a cow could reach on her hind legs, as if entire legions of beavers had been at work. That is the image John Clay, the Scotsman, wrote into his memoir. As the South Sea bubble burst, he wrote, as the Dutch tulip craze dissolved, this cattle gold brick withstood not the snow of winter. It wasted away under the fierce attacks of a subarctic season aided by summer drought. For years, you could wander amid the dead brushwood that borders our streams. In the struggle for existence, the cattle had peeled off the bark as if legions of beavers had been at work. The Laramie Daily Boomerang of February 10, 1887, reported that the snow on the Lost Soldier Division of the Lander and Rawlins stage route was 4 feet deep and frozen so hard that the stages drove over it like a turnpike. 4 feet of snow frozen into a road. Underneath it, somewhere, were the carcasses of cows that nobody would find until spring. Historians have argued about the actual losses for the better part of 140 years, because nobody at the time really knew how many cattle had been on the range to begin with, and nobody really knew how many were left when it was over. Some accounts, especially those by men trying to explain their bankruptcies to creditors, claimed losses of 70 or 80%. T.A. Larson estimated that overall, Wyoming lost about 15% of its herd. Some outfits in Crook County and Carbon County lost about 25%. But those numbers are based on book counts that everybody knew were lies. The real losses, measured against the cattle that were actually out there, not the cattle that the ledgers said were out there, were almost certainly worse. For the big English-owned outfits in particular, whose book counts were the most inflated, the disaster was catastrophic. The Powder River Cattle Company went broke. The shareholders in London, who had backed Moreton Frewen on the strength of his stories about a subtropical paradise of grass, watched their investment collapse along with the snowdrifts. The 76 brand, which had ranged tens of thousands of cattle across the Powder River country at its peak, was eventually sold. It went on a strange second journey afterward. A man named Sir John Lister Kay, an English baronet promoting a Canadian land development scheme on the western prairies, bought the entire herd in the early 1880s and took it north to what is now Saskatchewan. He kept the brand. He called the operation the 76 Ranch. The brand survived in Canada in various hands for decades after the Wyoming company that gave it its name had ceased to exist, but the brand was the only thing that survived intact. In Wyoming, what survived was a landscape strewn with dead cattle and a system of ranching whose every assumption had just been disproved. The Texas system, turning cattle loose to care for themselves year-round on stationary pastures without supplementary feeding or protection, had been imported north, intact, with all its subtropical confidence. The Powder River winter had answered it. The cattle could not care for themselves. They could not paw down through frozen crust to grass that was already overgrazed. They could not survive 60 below without shelter. The whole theory had been built on weather that did not come. The men who lost the most were, in many cases, the absentee investors who had never seen the range. But the men who had to live with the consequences were the ones who were still there. The cowboys, mostly out of work that spring because half the cattle they would have been working were dead. The small homesteaders, watching the country reorganize around them. The remaining big outfits, suddenly with smaller herds and angrier shareholders. And out of that reorganization, on a range that had just been emptied by the winter, the next phase of the struggle began. It was a struggle over what was left. The road to the Johnson County War is worth walking carefully, because the path from the killing winter of 1886 to 1887 to the invaders' train pulling out of Cheyenne in April 1892 is a 6-year drift, not a sudden break. 6 years of small killings, small lynchings, small intimidations, and a steady hardening on both sides. The Averill Watson lynching of July 1889 is the clearest signpost on that road. James Averill and Ella Watson held adjoining homesteads along the Sweetwater River in Carbon County in the southern part of the state, hundreds of miles from the Powder River. But the methods that were used against them set the template that would be used against Nate Champion 3 years later. 6 large stockmen rode up to Watson's cabin on a Saturday afternoon, dragged her out by force, picked up Averill from his store down the road, and hauled them both to a ravine where 2 cottonwoods stood. They put ropes around the necks of both prisoners, and they hanged them side by side, without trial and without warrant. The killers were identified by witnesses. They were arrested. They were released. The cases against them were eventually dismissed for lack of evidence that had been available before 2 key witnesses inexplicably died. In the days after the killings, the larger newspapers, many of them sympathetic to the WSGA, ran stories painting Ella Watson as a prostitute who had been paid for her favors in stolen cattle. The name Cattle Kate was invented in those columns. There is no evidence she had ever been known by that name in life. There is no evidence she took cattle in exchange for sexual services. There is evidence that she had filed a legal homestead claim, had purchased cattle on the open market, and had been building a working operation with Averill. The story that excused her killers was a lie, but it stuck for nearly 100 years. Until historians went back into the original records and pulled the lie apart. That was the political lesson the WSGA took from the summer of 1889. The lesson was that you could kill an inconvenient homesteader, you could lie about what you had done, and you could avoid prosecution through delay and witness intimidation. That lesson is the only thing that makes the decision to launch the 1892 invasion comprehensible. The men who signed off on sending 50 armed men into Johnson County had personal knowledge that this kind of operation could be carried out without legal consequence. They had run the experiment 3 years earlier on a much smaller scale, and they had gotten away with it. What they did not factor in was that Johnson County would not behave the way Carbon County had. Johnson County had a sheriff who would deputize 200 citizens before the smoke had cleared from any one cabin. Johnson County had local newspapers that would not run the WSGA's preferred narrative. Johnson County had a population that had been watching the lynchings down south with mounting fury, and that had organized itself in February of 1892 into a competing association, the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association. specifically to fight back. By the time the invaders boarded their train in Cheyenne, the country they were riding into was not the country they had planned for. It was a country that had already decided not to be killed off quietly. The first thing that changed, after the snow finally melted in the spring of 1887, was that the big cattlemen lost the political consensus that had made the boom possible. For more than a decade, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had been one of the most powerful political organizations in the West. It had been founded in Cheyenne in 1872, before the boom really took off, and by the early 1880s it controlled, or had close working relationships with, the territorial governor's office, the legislature, the courts, the major newspapers, and the federal land offices. Membership was by invitation. Dues were significant. The association's monthly meetings in Cheyenne were where the big decisions about Wyoming cattle were made. The cattle market reports, the brand registrations, the legal advice, the political endorsements, the lobbying agendas, all of it ran through the WSGA. By the late 1880s, the WSGA was wounded. Its dominant members had just lost staggering amounts of money. Many of the British and Eastern syndicates that had filled the association's roles in the early 1880s simply ceased to exist. The Frewens were gone. Several other big outfits were either bankrupt or in retrenchment. The Swan Land and Cattle Company, the largest of them all, had gone into receivership in 1887. Alexander Swan, who had been president of the WSGA, was out. What remained was a smaller core of survivors who controlled, or thought they controlled, the political machinery, and a much larger and faster-growing population of homesteaders and small ranchers in the basins to the north. Wyoming had counted just 9,118 people in 1870. By 1890, the population had grown to 62,555. Most of that growth was not in the cattlemen's Cheyenne, but in the country to the north, in Buffalo, in Sheridan, in Casey, in the small towns growing up along the railroads and the army forts. These were the people the cattlemen had begun calling rustlers. Some of them deserved the name. Cattle rustling was real. Mavericks, unbranded calves running with branded mothers, had always been a contested category, and the line between an honest rancher and a thief depended on whose ledger you were looking at. The big outfits, with their tens of thousands of cattle wandering hundreds of miles in any direction, were obvious targets. A homesteader with a small herd and a hot iron could, over a few years, increase his own count substantially at the expense of his enormous neighbors. Some men did this. Some men got caught. Some men ended up dead, hanged from cottonwoods along the streams that ran through what used to be the open range. But by the late 1880s, the big outfits had started using the word rustler as a political weapon. Almost any small rancher whose herd was growing was suspect. Almost any homesteader who would not sell out and move on was suspect. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, through its hired stock detectives, began drawing up lists. The lists were not always accurate. The lists did not always distinguish between actual thieves and inconvenient citizens. The lists were the kind of thing that, when the political environment allowed, could become a death warrant. The political environment allowed. In 1889, in a case that would echo through the rest of Wyoming history, two homesteaders in Carbon County named James Averill and Ella Watson were dragged off their claims and hanged by a group of large stockmen who accused them of cattle theft. Averill ran a store and a small post office. Watson, a former domestic servant, had filed her own homestead on land that adjoined his. There was no trial. There was no court hearing. There were just 6 men, a wagon, 2 ropes, and a cottonwood tree. The local press, much of it controlled by or sympathetic to the WSGA, ran a story that the woman had been a prostitute who had taken stolen cattle as payment. The story stuck, despite being almost entirely untrue. Ella Watson became, in the press of the time, Cattle Kate, a name she had never used in life. The cattlemen who hanged her and Averell were never convicted of anything. The lynching of Averell and Watson did not subdue the homesteaders. It enraged them. Across the basins to the north, men began to take stock of what was happening and to organize. In 1892, small stock growers in Johnson County, the heart of the old Powder River cattle country, formed their own organization. They called it the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association. They announced their intention to hold their own spring roundup separately from the WSGA, a month ahead of the official one. That was the line the big cattlemen could not let stand. A separate roundup meant that mavericks would be branded by whoever caught them first, rather than under the rules the WSGA had written. A separate roundup meant a parallel power structure in the country north of the Platte. A separate roundup meant, in the eyes of the surviving cattle barons of Cheyenne, the end of their last meaningful control over what happened in the Powder River Basin. In February 1892, in a Cheyenne courtroom, a preliminary hearing was held in the case of Joe Elliott, a WSGA stock detective who was charged with the attempted murder of a small Johnson County rancher named Nate Champion. Champion gave dramatic testimony. He had been attacked in his cabin some months earlier by a small group of men, had shot his way out, and could identify Elliott as one of the attackers. The county attorneys had built a strong case. If Elliott was convicted, the chain of responsibility would lead, everyone in Wyoming understood, directly back to the WSGA leadership in Cheyenne. In early March 1892, the big cattlemen made a decision. They were going to invade Johnson County. They would, they decided, take a special train north out of Cheyenne, ride into Johnson County under arms, kill the men whose names were on a list of 70 or more rustlers, beginning with Nate Champion, and then hold the town of Buffalo until federal troops arrived to restore what they called order. The plan was not formally voted on by the WSGA membership. It did not need to be. The men who controlled the association were the men funding the invasion. They hired 23 gunmen from Texas to augment the ranks of the invading stockmen. Several Wyoming stock detectives, including Frank Canton, the former sheriff of Johnson County who had switched sides, joined them. A former Union Army officer named Frank Wolcott, who had a reputation for arrogance and bad judgment in roughly equal measure, was chosen to lead the expedition. The whole force totaled around 50 men. They were known almost immediately and afterward by history as the Invaders. They boarded a special train in Cheyenne on the night of April 5, 1892. The train was loaded with horses, supplies, 3 wagons, ammunition. The expedition traveled in secrecy as far as Casper. From Casper, they rode north on horseback. They cut the telegraph lines along the way so that no warning could reach Buffalo. Their first target, by the spies' information, was at the K.C. Ranch on the Middle Fork of the Powder River, just south of what is now the town of Casey. That was where Nate Champion was supposed to be. He was. He was there with a friend named Nick Ray and 2 trappers who had stopped over for the night. The invaders surrounded the K.C. cabin in the small hours of April 9th, 1892, and waited for daylight. When the 2 trappers walked out at dawn to get water, the invaders captured them quietly. When Nick Ray walked out a little later, the invaders shot him down. He died inside the cabin after Nate Champion, under heavy fire, dragged him back through the door. Champion, alone now in the cabin, fought back. For hours, He kept firing, he kept reloading, he wounded several of the invaders, and almost unbelievably, he kept a journal as he fought. He wrote down what he was seeing through the windows. He wrote down the names of friends he could see across the river who could not get to him. He wrote down, knowing he would not survive, what he wanted his family to know. The journal would later be found on his body. It is one of the most extraordinary primary source documents of the entire American West. By the afternoon of April 9th, the invaders had decided to burn him out. They loaded a wagon with hay and pine, set it on fire, and pushed it against the cabin. The cabin caught. Champion, choking on smoke, stuffed his journal into his pocket, took up a pistol in one hand and a knife in the other, and made a run for it out the back. 4 men shot him down before he had gone 20 steps. The invaders walked over to his body, pinned a note to his bullet-torn shirt that read, "Cattle thieves beware," and rode on. They did not know yet that the country was already alerted. A passing rancher named Jack Flagg, who had heard the shooting and seen what was happening, had ridden hard for Buffalo. Sheriff William Red Angus of Johnson County, on hearing Flagg's report, began deputizing every able-bodied man who would ride with him. By the time the invaders reached the area of the TA Ranch, about 14 miles south of Buffalo, on April 10th, a posse of roughly 200 men was on its way to meet them. The invaders barricaded themselves at the TA. They threw up earthworks. They cut firing positions in the barn. They had the better positions and the better weapons and the better food, but they were outnumbered by at least 4 to 1, and Sheriff Angus's posse kept growing. The siege of the TA Ranch had begun. For 2 days, the two sides exchanged fire. The first invader to die was a gunman named Jim Dudley, killed in the early hours of the siege. The posse, growing more determined as more men rode in from the surrounding country, began to assemble what they called a go-devil, a wagon piled high with hay and dynamite, which they planned to push burning against the barn, the same way the invaders had pushed their burning wagon against Nate Champion's cabin. The posse intended to burn out the men who had burned out Champion. The invaders, holed up at the TA, knew the go-devil was coming. They had time, before it was finished, to send one rider out under cover of darkness. He carried a message west to a telegraph station that had not been cut. From there it went to Cheyenne, to the territorial acting governor, and from him by wire to Washington. In Washington, President Benjamin Harrison was notified. Harrison was the friend and political ally of several of the men who had funded the invasion. On the morning of April 13, 1892, he ordered the 6th Cavalry, stationed at Fort McKinney just outside Buffalo, to ride to the TA Ranch and take the invaders into protective custody. The cavalry rode out. They reached the TA before the go-devil was ready. They placed the 50 invaders, all of them by then exhausted and out of food, and quite certain they were about to be burned alive under the Army's protection. The invaders surrendered their weapons. They listed them carefully. The Army took them away, not to a Johnson County jail, where they would almost certainly have been killed, but to Fort McKinney, then to Fort D. Russell at Cheyenne, then back into the political system that had sent them. Not one of them was ever convicted of anything. Johnson County had no money to prosecute. The invaders' attorneys, working for the WSGA, dragged the cases through delay after delay. Witnesses disappeared or were intimidated. The territory of Wyoming, which had just become the state of Wyoming in 1890, did not want the case. Eventually, the charges were dropped. The men who had murdered Nate Champion and Nick Ray walked free, and the men who had hired them walked free with them. But the cattle barons did not win. They had broken their own political legitimacy by hiring 23 Texas killers to do what they could not do through the courts. The Republican Party in Wyoming, closely tied to the WSGA, suffered for years afterward. The big outfits never regained the unchallenged dominance they had enjoyed before 1886. The basin that had built and broken Moreton Frewen and the Powder River Cattle Company belonged more and more to the smaller men who had stayed. The country itself had decided. The winter of 1886 to 87 had decided what the range could carry. The Johnson County War had decided who got to graze it. And both of those answers were the opposite of the answers the boom had been built on. It is worth stopping for a moment with what Nate Champion wrote, because his journal is the closest thing the Powder River Cattle Wars produced to a voice from the inside of the storm. Champion was 34 years old when he died. He had been born in Texas, in Williamson County, in 1857. He had come north with the cattle drives like so many of his generation, and had ended up working on ranches in Wyoming through the 1880s. By the late 1880s, he had taken up a small operation of his own. According to one account, at the time of his death, he had about 200 head of cattle and 8 pack horses, all just paid for. He was not a wealthy man. He was not a baron. He was the kind of small operator that the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had decided by 1892 was a threat that needed to be eliminated. The journal he kept inside the burning cabin on April 9, 1892, was written in pencil on whatever scraps of paper he had at hand. He noted the times. He noted the gunfire. He noted Nick Ray dying beside him. He noted the men he could see across the river, friends who had ridden up to investigate the shooting and could not break through the cordon to help him. He wrote about the dog the invaders had killed in the yard. He wrote about how he expected to die and how the friends he had not been able to reach should know what had happened to him. And to Nick, he addressed a few lines to his brother. Near the end, he wrote a single line that has become one of the most famous lines in Wyoming history. It read simply, "The house is all fired. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again." He signed it Nathan D. Champion. Then he went out the back door and was shot to death. The invaders pinned their note to his shirt and rode on. They did not search his pockets carefully. The journal was found on his body when the posse reached the smoldering ruin of the K.C. cabin the next day. It was published in newspapers within weeks. It made Nate Champion, a man the WSGA had wanted erased, into the most famous small rancher in the West. The cattle barons had wanted to make him an example. They had, but not the example they intended. He became instead the example of what the cattle barons had become. And what they had become was a group of men, mostly investors, mostly absentee, mostly tied to a system that the country had already broken once, who were prepared to murder American citizens on American soil to protect a power that was already slipping out of their hands. The other thing the Champion Journal made unmistakably clear was that the invaders had not come into Johnson County looking for cattle thieves in any normal legal sense. They had come with a list of names. They had cut the telegraph wires. They had brought 23 hired Texas guns. They had a wagon of rations, a doctor, ammunition for an extended fight, and what amounted to a written kill list. They did not announce themselves. They did not present warrants. They did not call on the sheriff of Johnson County, William Angus, who was an elected officer of the law. They came in the dark, and they killed in the dawn. By any standard, then or since, this was not law enforcement. It was an armed political assassination. That was the shape of what the Powder River boom had finally become. The cowboys who had ridden through all of it watched the transformation with a mixture of fear, anger, and exhausted resignation. Many of them had personally known Nate Champion. Some of them had ridden for Frank Canton when he had been the sheriff of Johnson County, rather than a hired gun for the WSGA. The invaders included men whose faces were known to half the cattle outfits in the basin. There was no mystery about who they were. The mystery, if there was one, was about what would happen to them. And the answer, in time, turned out to be very little. Of the 50-odd invaders held at Fort D.A. Russell, the majority were eventually released without trial. The hired Texans were quietly returned to Texas. The cattlemen who had funded the expedition went back to their ranches and their clubs. Some of them lost political offices over the next decade. Some of them did not. Frank Canton, who had led the gunmen alongside Major Wolcott, eventually went on to Alaska and Oklahoma, and a long and storied career in various forms of frontier law enforcement and frontier killing. In Johnson County, the men who had stood with the sheriff at the TA siege did not forget. The county became, for a generation afterward, one of the most reliably Democratic counties in a state that voted overwhelmingly Republican. The Republican Party in Wyoming, tied so closely to the WSGA and the Cheyenne establishment, paid a political price for what had happened on the Powder River that took years to fully come due. Meanwhile, the country itself was doing what the country does. It was reorganizing without asking anyone's permission. Sheep were coming into the basin in larger and larger numbers. By 1909, the value of Wyoming sheep would exceed the value of Wyoming cattle by a wide margin. $32 million in sheep versus $26 million in cattle. Wyoming would have 7.3 million sheep and only 960,000 head of cattle, and would lead the nation in both wool and sheep production. The same range that had been built into a cattle empire was being rebuilt by a different set of operators with different animals into a sheep empire. The big outfits that did survive, like the Swan, came out of the receivership of 1887 changed. They began to do what the boom-era ranchers had refused to do. They began to buy land instead of just claiming the public domain. They put up fences, they put up hay barns, they cut and stored hay against the next bad winter. They reduced their stocking rates. They began to look, in other words, more like the ranches of the next century than like the cattle empires of the 1880s. The homesteaders kept coming. The 1909 revision to the Homestead Act, which doubled the amount of free land a settler could claim, brought a second wave of dryland farmers into northeast Wyoming. Some of them made it, many of them did not. The country, even with twice as much land per claimant, was still too dry and too cold to be farmed the way it could be farmed in Iowa. The story of the Powder River Basin after 1900 became, in many ways, the story of small operations adapting and consolidating and learning over decades what would and would not grow on those plains. But the cattle boom, the specific world-shaking, capital-flooding, English-driven, book-counted, Texas system cattle boom of 1868 to 1886 never came back. Wyoming cattle prices would not reach $7 per hundredweight again until 1910. By then, sheep were ascendant. By then, the railroads were carrying out as much wool and lamb as beef. By then, the men who had drunk wine and shucked oysters at the Cheyenne Club in 1885 were dead, or scattered, or quiet in their reduced offices on quieter streets. The boom era had lasted, if you measure it from the first big cattle drives north in 1868 to the killing winter of 1886, exactly 18 years. 18 years to build the largest free-range cattle industry the world had ever seen. One winter to break it. And the deaths that came after the cattle deaths, Nate Champion, Nick Ray, James Averill, Ella Watson, and the others whose names did not make the papers, were the human price of the political fight over what the country would become after the cattle were buried. The country, in the end, became the country. It did not become a Texas pasture relocated north. It did not become a London investment portfolio with cows attached. It became what the weather and the geography and the people who actually lived on it would let it become. That was a quieter answer than anyone in the Interocean Hotel bar in Cheyenne in 1882 would have predicted, but it was the answer the Powder River gave. What happened to the people in this story is, in many ways, the most honest measure of what the boom actually did to those who were caught up in it. Moreton Frewen, the man whose horse race loss had brought him to the Powder River in the first place, lived for decades after his removal from the Powder River Cattle Company. He returned to England, but he did not stay home. He spent the rest of his life chasing schemes and investments and the next big idea in Wyoming and in India and in Africa and in Cuba and back in England. He wrote articles for journals about monetary policy. He campaigned unsuccessfully for a seat in Parliament. He traveled and dined and wrote letters and proposed projects. He had married, in 1881, an American woman named Clara Jerome, one of the Jerome sisters of New York, and through that marriage, he became the brother-in-law of Jenny Jerome, who would marry Lord Randolph Churchill and give birth to a son named Winston. Moreton Frewen, the bankrupted cattleman of the Powder River, was Winston Churchill's uncle. He died in 1924, the year his autobiography, Melton Mowbray and Other Memories, was published. The cowboy's nickname for him had stuck. To the end, those who remembered the Powder River days called him Mortal Ruin. Richard Frewen, his older brother, went his separate way after the partnership broke up in 1882. He traveled to Africa and tangled with Lobengula, the king of the Matabele, in a series of misadventures that nearly ended in his death. He spent his later years in England. He did not return to Wyoming. Frewen's castle itself stood for a time as a monument to the era. The cowboys still called it Castle Frewen, but the great house that had hosted English barons and Lake Albert explorers was eventually abandoned. It burned down in the early 1900s. Today, Castle Street and Castle Creek in the township of Midwest Wyoming are the only marks left on the map. The grass that ran around the foundation has grown back over what was once a hardwood ballroom shipped piece by piece from England. Fred G. S. Hesse, the foreman of the 76, and later the owner of his own 28 ranch on Crazy Woman Creek, was one of the few men in this story who succeeded by every reasonable measure. He had come to America in 1873 at age 21. He had worked for the Frewens through every up and down of the boom and the collapse. He stayed in Wyoming after his employers had gone home. He continued to operate the 28 ranch and to manage the 76 holdings. He served as a member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and he was, according to the Johnson County Record, one of the men who participated in the 1892 invasion. Yes, Fred Hesse rode with the invaders. He had been with Moreton Frewen on the Powder River since 1879. He had watched the boom unfold from the inside. He had watched the homesteaders move in. And when the WSGA decided to send 50 men with rifles into Johnson County, Hesse was one of them. He was not a Texas-hired gun. He was a long-time Powder River operator who had taken the side of the cattle barons against the people who had been, by then, his neighbors for a decade. After the surrender at the TA Ranch, Hesse was held with the rest, was released without trial, and returned to ranching. He lived in Wyoming until his death in 1928. The Fred Hesse papers, including documents from his decades on the Powder River and his role in the invasion, are now archived at the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming. Nate Champion was buried in the cemetery at Buffalo. His grave is still there. The journal he kept in the burning KC cabin became one of the most reproduced primary source documents of the West, printed in countless histories and quoted in countless books. His brother Dudley Champion, who came to Wyoming later to settle his brother's estate, was himself killed in 1893 by a man who had been one of the invaders. Mike Chauncey, the same Mike Chauncey who had told the invaders the night before the KC attack that Nate would be at the KC cabin. The killing of Dudley Champion was ruled self-defense. Chauncey was not prosecuted. He went on to a long career as a working cattleman in Wyoming and Nebraska and died of natural causes decades later. Nick Ray, Champion's friend, who had been shot down in the cabin doorway, was buried next to Champion in Buffalo. His name appears in the official records of the Johnson County War, but he was not a famous man before that morning, and he is remembered today mostly because he died beside Nate Champion. Sheriff Red Angus of Johnson County, who had led the 200-man posse that surrounded the TA Ranch, served out his term and remained a respected figure in northern Wyoming for the rest of his life. The men who had ridden with him kept the story alive locally for generations. Frank Canton, the former Johnson County sheriff, who had become a WSGA stock detective and then a leader of the invaders, left Wyoming after the war and went on to careers as a lawman in Oklahoma, in Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush, and back in Oklahoma as adjutant general of the state militia. He wrote a memoir before he died in 1927. In it, he gave his own account of what had happened in Johnson County. His account does not agree, at most points, with the accounts of the men who fought against him. Major Frank Wolcott, the Union Army veteran who had led the invasion, went back to private life in Cheyenne. He was never prosecuted. He died in 1910. Of the 70-some Texas gunmen and Wyoming stock detectives on the invaders list, most went home to obscurity. Some kept ranching in Wyoming. A few died violent deaths in the years afterward. None served prison time for the killings at the KC Ranch. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association itself survived. It exists today, headquartered in Cheyenne, as the oldest cattlemen's organization in Wyoming. Its modern members are working ranchers, not absentee British investors, and the organization has spent much of the last century building a different kind of relationship with the state. But it has never fully escaped the long shadow of 1892. Every Wyoming child who grows up on a ranch eventually learns, one way or another, what happened at the KC and at the TA. The names Champion and Ray and Angus and Canton are still spoken in Johnson County the way the names of Confederate and Union officers are still spoken in old corners of Virginia. Beyond the people, there was what happened to the country itself. The Powder River grass came back, slowly, after the winter of 1886 to 87. The country had not been ruined. It had been emptied. The next generation of cattlemen, smaller and more careful and more rooted to the land, learned to graze it differently. They cut hay in summer for winter feed. They put up fences where the courts allowed. They raised crossbred cattle better suited to the cold than the Texas Longhorns had been. They built more permanent housing. They sent their children to schools that did not exist during the boom. Towns that had been almost nothing during the boom grew into county seats and trading centers. Buffalo, which had grown up around Fort McKinney in 1878, became the county seat of Johnson County and remains so today. Sheridan, north of Buffalo near the Montana border, became a center for ranching and later for coal. Gillette, founded with the arrival of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad in 1891, became the largest town in the southern Powder River Basin. KC, the small settlement near the site of the KC Ranch attack, is still a working ranch town today. The KC cabin itself is gone. A vacant lot in downtown KC, marked by a small monument, sits where the cabin stood. The TA Ranch south of Buffalo is still a working ranch and is open as a guest ranch and historic site. The bullet holes are still in the walls. The 76 brand, which had begun on the Powder River with the Frewen brothers in 1879, had its own strange afterlife. Sir John Lister Kay, an English baronet promoting an enormous Canadian land settlement scheme in the late 1880s, bought the entire herd of the Powder River Ranch, including the 76 brand, and shipped the cattle north into what is now Saskatchewan. He kept the brand. He renamed the new Canadian operation the 76 Ranch. It was a sprawling Canadian outfit with at one point 10 different farms, each with its own two-story house, bunkhouse, stable, granary, windmill, blacksmith shop, harness room, and various sheds for cattle, sheep, and pigs. The Crane Lake Farm, in 1890, was made the headquarters of the whole operation. The 76 Ranch in Canada also met its own brutal winter. The winter of 1906 to 1907, sometimes remembered in Canada as the Killing Winter, the way 1886 to 87 is remembered in the United States, wiped out roughly 2/3 of the 76 herd in a single season. The same pattern played out almost exactly 20 years later on a different range, with different cattle, owned by different investors, supervised by different managers, and yet it ended in the same way. The British owners sold the 76 to a firm called Gordon, Ironsides and Fairs in 1909. The ranch operated under various owners through the 1910s before being permanently broken up in 1921. The brand changed hands a number of times after that, eventually returning to the area in 1945. The records of the Canadian 76 Ranch are preserved today in the provincial archives in Saskatchewan. 2 killing winters, 2 continents, 2 sets of investors, 2 collapses, and 1 brand, riding through it all like a small wooden chip on a very large and unforgiving river. The Powder River Basin itself did not stop being important after the cattle boom collapsed. It just became important for different reasons. The first sign that something was changing came with the railroads. The Burlington reached Sheridan in 1892, the same year as the Johnson County War, and continued north to Montana in 1894. The railroads opened the basin to industrial extraction in ways that the open range had not. Coal had been known in the Powder River country since the 1870s. Dietz, the oldest Sheridan coal camp, opened in 1893. Coal mines and oil discoveries followed through the 1900s and 1910s. In 1922, a scandal involving oil leases around Teapot Dome in the southern part of the Powder River Basin led to the jailing of U.S. Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, the first sitting cabinet officer in American history to go to prison for crimes committed in office. The Powder River had produced its first national political scandal. A bigger one was coming in slower form beneath the ground. What Struthers Burt in his 1938 book, Powder River. Letter Buck called The Story of Grass, the search for it, the fight for it, the slow disappearance of it, was about to be overtaken by a different story. The grass that had been buried millions of years ago, cured into thick seams of coal underneath the basin, was about to become the dominant resource of the region. The Powder River coal boom started in the 1970s. The biggest mine by production volume, Black Thunder, opened in 1977. The company town of Wright sprang up near Reno Junction, beginning with a 108-unit mobile home park. Today, northeast Wyoming produces about 40% of the nation's coal. That coal generates roughly 1/5 of the country's electricity. Roughly 14% of America's greenhouse gas emissions come from burning Powder River Basin coal. The basin that the cattlemen had thought of as empty has turned out to be one of the most economically consequential pieces of ground in North America. The 8 largest coal mines in the United States, by tonnage, are all located there. Campbell County, where most of those mines are situated, produced about $4.5 billion worth of taxable minerals in 2010, more than any other county in Wyoming. In 2008 alone, the coal mines directly employed more than 6,800 workers. A second extractive industry came on in the 1990s. Coal bed methane, the natural gas that lies trapped in coal seams underground, became economically extractable in the 1990s, and more than 20,000 wells were drilled across the Powder River Basin during that decade and into the early 2000s. Wyoming now produces about 1/5 of the nation's domestic coal bed methane. Some of those wells sit on land that the federal government technically still owns the mineral rights to, but that ranching families have lived on for generations, creating what is called a split estate situation. Surface owner versus mineral rights holder in conflict over what happens to the land. The cattle barons of the 1880s could not have imagined any of this. They thought the basin was about grass. They were not entirely wrong. There is still grass in the Powder River Basin, and there are still ranches running cattle on it. But the basin's role in the national economy has shifted over the century and a half since Moreton Frewen first saw it, from cattle to coal to gas, and what remains of the cattle industry, there is now one part of a much larger and more complicated economic landscape. Many residents of the basin today still practice agriculture and still identify with their cattle and sheep ranching roots. The Wyoming brand book still lists hundreds of working ranch brands. Some of those brands trace back, by lineage of ownership, to the same families who held them in the 1880s and 1890s, survivors of the boom and bust, holdouts of the homesteader generation, descendants of the cowboys who never went back south. They still rely, as the Cheyenne newspaper editor Nathan Baker observed in 1867, on the Powder River grass to fatten their livestock. The grass keeps coming back year after year on a country that has now been grazed by cattle for 150 years and counting. The professional bareback rider and country music star Chris Ledoux, who died of cancer in 2005, captured the spirit of the modern Powder River country in his music. One of his songs runs, in part, where the river winds from the bighorns up above and the clear moon shines on the prairie that I love. It's the closest place to heaven that this cowboy's ever known. I'm going back to my Powder River home. That country, the country of the modern song, is the country that emerged after the cattle barons fell. It is not the country they tried to build. It is the country that was left when their construction collapsed, and the people who actually had to live on the ground put their lives back together. There is one other piece of the legacy that is worth saying out loud, because it is the part that is easiest to leave out of the cattle barons' stories. The boom happened on land that had been taken, actively, recently, and with great violence, from people who had lived on it for centuries. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had promised the Powder River country to the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. The 1874 Custer expedition broke that promise. The 1876 campaign and the killing of Crazy Horse in 1877 and the exile of Dull Knife's Northern Cheyenne to Indian Territory in 1878 made the breaking of the promise permanent. By the time Moreton Frewen rode into the basin in April 1879, the people who had been removed from it had been gone for less than 2 years. The grass that he saw running to the horizon was grass that the bison had been driven off of within his memory. The country that he called empty had been emptied by a federal policy of removal whose ink was barely dry. The 4,500 head of cattle he turned out on the Powder River that summer were grazing on bones that were still warm. The cattlemen who came after him grazed on the same bones. The homesteaders who came after the cattlemen grazed on the same bones. The coal that comes out of Black Thunder Mine today is hauled out of land whose original people were forced off of it in 1876 and 1877. None of this is hidden history. All of it is in the federal record, in the treaty record, in the Army's own dispatches and the U.S. Indian agents' own reports. It is in the encyclopedia entries on every fort and battle the Army fought across this basin. It is the foundation that the whole cattle boom was built on. The boom was, in this sense, the second wave of a single sustained policy. The first wave had been military and political. The second wave was economic. The bison had been shot off the range. The tribes had been forced onto reservations. The federal lands had been declared empty and open. And into that emptiness, manufactured by force and ratified by Congress, the cattle had come. The cattle and the British capital and the Texas system and the book counts and the cowboys and the dance halls in Cheyenne, and finally the invaders with their cut telegraph wires and their wagons of dynamite. All of it stood on a piece of ground that had been cleared for them. This does not erase what the cowboys did, or what the homesteaders endured, or what the winter of 1886 to 87 cost. Those things happened. Those people suffered and worked and died and built. But the larger frame, the question of who was on this land first and how they came to be off it, is part of the Powder River story too, and any honest telling has to include it. The Crow Nation still exists on a reservation that lies just over the Montana line from where Frewen's castle once stood. The Northern Cheyenne Reservation is also just across that line, established after the Northern Cheyenne fled north from their exile in Indian Territory and refused to go back. The Lakota agencies are spread across the Dakotas. The descendants of the people who hunted bison in the Powder River Basin in 1850 are alive today. They have not forgotten the basin. They have not forgotten the treaties. The wounded conversation between the federal government and the Lakota over the Black Hills, which the courts ruled in 1980 had been illegally seized, continues. The Lakota have refused, since the ruling, to accept the financial compensation that was offered to them. They want the land. That is the larger ground on which the Powder River cattle boom played out, and the cattle boom, looked at in that light, was one chapter of a much longer story about what kind of country the American West was going to become, and at what cost. The Wyoming cattle business never again achieved the stature it had from 1868 to 1886. That is what the historians have said, and it is correct. But the more interesting question is what the cattle business became in the basin after 1886, because it did not disappear. It just got smaller, slower, and harder. The men who had stayed through the killing winter learned that they could not trust the assumptions the Texas system had been built on. They could not rely on year-round grazing without supplementary feed. They could not assume that the winter would be mild. They could not run cows on grass that had already been overgrazed and expect those cows to come through to spring. They had to put up hay. They had to fence. They had to count their actual animals rather than their book count animals. They had to plan for the worst winter in living memory and hope for something better. Every one of those changes was an admission that the boom-era model had been wrong. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association reorganized itself in the years after the Johnson County War, but it did so with a much weaker political hand. The cattlemen were no longer the only voice in the territory. By the time Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, the homesteaders, the miners, the railroad workers, and the sheepmen all had political weight. The Republican Party that had been so closely identified with the WSGA was, by the end of the 1890s, openly contested by populists and Democrats. The cattle interests still mattered. They just did not get to dictate. That is a quieter outcome than the one the boom promised. It is also, looking back, the more healthy outcome. A region run entirely for the benefit of absentee investors counting cows they had never seen was never going to be a stable place to live or work or raise children. The country that emerged after 1886, with its smaller ranches and its small towns and its mixed economy of cattle and sheep and railroads and coal, was a less spectacular country than the one Moreton Frewen and Walter von Richthofen had imagined. It was also a country that could last. The cowboys themselves are worth one more look here, because the boom era had created a working class that the bust era had to absorb. The classic open-range cowboy, drifting with the herds, sleeping under the stars, working for $30 a month and food, was a creature of a specific economic moment. After 1886, that moment was over. The cowboy did not disappear, but his job changed. He worked for smaller outfits. He stayed in one place longer. He learned to cut hay and fix fence as well as to rope and brand. He sometimes took up his own homestead. He sometimes married a homesteader's daughter. He sometimes died in his sleep at age 72 on the same piece of ground he had ridden up to at age 20. The dime novel cowboy went into mythology. The actual cowboy went into the long, hard work of making a real life in the country he had helped graze down. Some of those cowboys came from places the standard mythology has almost erased. There were Mexican vaqueros riding for the big outfits, men who had taught the Texas cowboys most of what they knew about rope and saddle, but whose names rarely made it into the official histories. There were black cowboys, like the famous Nat Love, and a great many less famous men, whose names appear only in payroll ledgers, who had come up the trails from Texas and stayed in the northern ranges. The Texas system, despite its hostility to the Mexican cultural roots it had grown out of, ran on Mexican equipment and Mexican vocabulary, and it ran on the labor of men of every color the post-Civil War American population had to offer. The Native American history of the Basin did not end in 1877 either. The Crow Nation, just over the Montana line, maintained a continuous presence in the country that included parts of the Bighorns. Crow Scouts had ridden with the U.S. Army during the campaigns of 1876 and after. The Northern Cheyenne, exiled to Indian Territory after the Dull Knife Battle of 1876, made one of the most famous breakouts in American Indian history in 1878, with Dull Knife and Little Wolf leading several hundred of their people on a desperate march north to escape disease and starvation on the southern reservation. They did not all make it. Some of them died fighting, but enough of them reached the north that the federal government eventually conceded a Northern Cheyenne reservation in Montana in 1884. The tribes were not gone from the country. The cattle barons had pretended they were. The country itself knew better. The cabin where Nate Champion died was burned. The site is marked today by a small monument on the edge of KC, in a vacant lot, a stone's throw from the middle fork of the Powder. The cottonwoods along the river still stand. The river still runs. Local guides still bring visitors out to the place to tell them, in person, what happened on the morning of April 9th, 1892. The TA Ranch, where the invaders made their stand and were finally rescued by the 6th Cavalry, is one of the most remarkably preserved historical sites of the cattle wars. The main ranch house and the barn from 1892 are still standing. The earthworks that the invaders threw up during the siege are still visible. The bullet holes in the barn walls are still there more than 130 years later. Walking through the site, a visitor can stand where Major Wolcott stood, where Frank Canton stood, where the hired Texans stood, and where Sheriff Red Angus's posse of 200 Johnson County men closed in on them through the trees. The TA today operates as a working ranch and a heritage site. It is, in the literal sense, a place where a piece of the country's history was almost buried and instead was preserved. Fort McKinney, the Army post that Buffalo had grown up around, is no longer an active military installation. The fort was decommissioned in 1894, just 2 years after the 6th Cavalry rode out of it to save the lives of the invaders. The town of Buffalo has kept growing, but the fort itself has become a Wyoming State Veterans Home. The parade ground where the troops once mustered is still there. The history is still in the soil. The graves of Nate Champion and Nick Ray at the Buffalo Cemetery are visited regularly by descendants of the Johnson County families who stood with Sheriff Angus in April 1892. Champion's journal is held in the Jim Gatchell Memorial Museum in Buffalo alongside other artifacts of the cattle wars. The museum keeps these things on display because the people of Johnson County made a decision a long time ago that they were going to remember what happened on their land, and that they were going to remember it from the side of the men who had been murdered, not the side of the men who had murdered them. That is, in a sense, the final ledger of the Powder River cattle boom. The cattle barons are not commemorated on Wyoming's main monuments. There are no equestrian statues to Moreton Frewen on the courthouse squares. There is no major Wolcott Memorial Highway. Frank Canton has historical markers, but they tend to recount his career as a lawman in Oklahoma rather than dwell on his role in Johnson County. The Cheyenne Club, the most opulent expression of the boom-era cattle aristocracy, was demolished in 1936. Its mansard roof, under which oysters were once shucked for absentee British millionaires, is gone. What does remain, what the country has chosen to remember, are the smaller things. The grave of Nate Champion, the bullet holes at the TA, the simple monument in the vacant lot at KC, the Jim Gatchell Museum's quiet collection, the grass that runs out toward the bighorns from the eastern face of the range, the same grass the cattle barons saw, growing back every year out of the same earth their disaster was buried in. The country remembered what mattered. It is not what they thought would matter in the Interocean Hotel bar in 1882, when the Chicago Packers crowded the bar and the wholesale prices ticked up, and Cheyenne built itself an opera house on the strength of borrowed money and unfounded confidence. It mattered, in the end, who had stood the country and stayed, and not who had ridden through it on the way to somewhere else. The legal aftermath of the Johnson County War deserves its own accounting because the way the courts handled the invasion is part of the story of why the boom era could not be salvaged even when the bullets stopped flying. The 50-odd invaders had been turned over to federal troops at the TA Ranch in mid-April 1892. They were held first at Fort McKinney near Buffalo, then transferred under heavy guard to Fort D.A. Russell outside Cheyenne. Johnson County wanted them tried in Johnson County, where the murders had been committed and where any jury would have known the victims by name. The WSGA's lawyers, working through the territorial courts, fought the venue. They argued that Johnson County could not provide an impartial jury, an argument that had a certain dark humor to it, given that the men they were defending had ridden in with the explicit purpose of bypassing any local jury. The case was eventually moved to Cheyenne, the WSGA's home ground. Johnson County, which was supposed to bear the prosecution costs, did not have the money. Feeding and housing the invaders alone, even with the WSGA paying part of the bill, was draining the county treasury. The trial was delayed. Witnesses whose names had appeared in the original Johnson County grand jury reports began to disappear. Some moved out of state, some were intimidated. At least one was paid. One key witness, a man named George Dunning, who had been an invader himself and who had given a sworn confession describing the operation in detail, was the closest thing to a smoking gun the prosecution had. His confession is one of the most important surviving documents of the war, but his usefulness in the courtroom was compromised by his status as a turncoat and by procedural maneuvers that the defense used to keep it out of evidence. In January 1893, after months of delay, the case fell apart. The defendants were released. The charges were dropped. The 50 men who had ridden into Johnson County in April 1892 walked out of the Cheyenne courthouse as free men. The Texas hired guns went back to Texas. The Wyoming stock detectives went back to their work. The cattle barons who had funded the operation went back to their clubs and their offices. Some of them dropped out of the WSGA leadership in the years that followed, quietly. Some of them stayed. The political costs, though, were real. The Republican Party in Wyoming, which had been closely tied to the WSGA, lost ground in the elections of 1892 and 1894. Johnson County, which had been a swing county before the invasion, became a reliably Democratic county for a generation. The state's congressional delegation, which had been entirely Republican during the territorial years, became contested. The populist movement, which was sweeping the Plains states in the 1890s, found receptive ground in northern Wyoming for reasons that had everything to do with the WSGA's behavior. A man named John B. Kendrick, who had come up from Texas as a young cowboy in the 1880s and had become a major Sheridan area rancher by the 1890s, would eventually be elected governor of Wyoming in 1914 and U.S. Senator in 1916, partly on the strength of his standing as a working cattleman who was not associated with the Cheyenne Club crowd. His political career was, in a sense, one of the long-running corrections to what the WSGA had done in 1892. The homesteaders who had stood at the TA Ranch with Sheriff Angus did not, in most cases, become famous. They went back to their claims. They put up hay. They got through the next several winters. Some of them prospered. Some of them lost their places. Their children went to schools in Buffalo and Sheridan and KC. Their grandchildren are still there. The names that come down through Johnson County history are not the names of Texas gunmen. They are the names of the families who proved up on their claims and stayed. There is one more piece of the legacy that is hard to leave out, and that is what happened to the bigger picture of corporate cattle ranching across the West. The collapse of the Powder River Cattle Company and the Swanland and Cattle Company and dozens of similar British and Eastern outfits in 1886 and 1887 was the end of a particular form of capitalism. It was not the end of corporate ranching. The big outfits that survived, and there were some, like the reorganized Swan, adapted. They bought land instead of just claiming the open range. They diversified, they cut hay, they put up fence. They became, over time, working agricultural businesses rather than speculative investment vehicles. The shift from absentee speculation to working operation, painful as it was for the speculators, was the thing that allowed the Powder River Basin to become a real cattle country rather than a stock ticker country. That shift was not generous. It was forced. The country forced it. The weather forced it. The political backlash from Johnson County forced it. The homesteaders who refused to be driven off their claims forced it. The cowboys who quietly, year by year, took up their own land and went into business for themselves forced it. The boom was killed by the country, the bust was managed by the survivors, and the rebuilt cattle industry of the 20th century was built by people who had learned the hard way that the brochure version of the West was a lie. There is a sentence in John Clay's memoir that is worth coming back to one more time. He wrote about the boom, about the bust, about the snow that finally came down, that this cattle gold brick withstood not the snow of winter. He wrote that for years afterward you could wander among the dead brushwood that bordered the streams. That, in the struggle for existence, the cattle had peeled off the bark of the cottonwoods as if legions of beavers had been at work. That is the image to hold on to. Cottonwoods, stripped to the height a starving cow could reach on her hind legs, marking the streams that ran through the basin like a long ledger of what the boom had actually cost. Not just the cattle, not just the dollars, not just the broken corporations and the ruined careers and the dead men at the KC Ranch. The country itself, marked, the country wearing the price of what had been tried on it. The Powder River boom was, in its broadest reading, an experiment. It was a test of what would happen if you took a system of cattle raising that had been developed in subtropical lowlands and dropped it intact onto a high, dry, cold inland basin where the winters could fall to 60 below. It was a test of what would happen if you flooded that experiment with absentee capital, kept the books on guesswork, and trusted the weather to behave the way the brochures said it would. It was a test of what would happen when the experiment failed if the people who had bet on it were willing to murder their neighbors rather than admit that the experiment had ended. The country gave the answer. The country always gives the answer eventually, on its own time and its own terms. The answer was that the experiment did not work, that the Texas system could not be transplanted whole, that the book counts were lies, that the homesteaders could not be killed off fast enough to save the system, and that the country itself had its own ideas about what could be done on it. The country won. It always does. It just takes a while. What happened on the Powder River matters because it is one of the clearest cases in American history of an entire economic order being built on assumptions that were already wrong when they were written down, and being defended, after they failed, with the tools of last resort. The 50 invaders who rode north out of Cheyenne on the night of April 5th, 1892, were not the cause of anything. They were a symptom. They were what an empire does when its empire is already over and it does not yet know how to stop. The men they killed, Nate Champion above all, were not heroes in the way that a dime novel would draw them. They were small ranchers of mixed backgrounds and mixed motives, some of them probably guilty of the small thefts and rebranding and maverick-taking that the cattlemen accused them of. But they were not criminals in the sense that justified what was done to them. They were citizens. They had filed legal claims under federal law. They were entitled to trials, to defenses, to the protection of the sheriff who lived in the same county they did. They got instead hired Texas guns and cut telegraph wires and a burning wagon pushed against their cabin door. The fact that none of the men who organized that operation ever served a day in prison for it is part of the story, too. Not the romantic part, not the part that gets put on the markers, but the part that explains why the next generation of Powder River ranchers did not trust the courts, did not trust the Cattlemen's Association, and did not trust the political establishment in Cheyenne. They had reason. They had watched what those institutions had done. If there is a single thing to take away from this episode of the Western Pioneer Archives, it is this. The cattle boom of the Powder River was sold to the world in its own time as the surest investment in America. Walter von Richthofen wrote in 1885 that there was not the slightest amount of uncertainty in cattle raising. He wrote it the same year the bubble popped. He wrote it without knowing it had already popped. And his confidence is a more important historical artifact than any of his predictions because it is a perfect specimen of the kind of certainty that comes right before a collapse. There is, in the end, no monument worth building to the certainty of men who never had to live with the consequences of being wrong. The monuments worth building are smaller, quieter, and harder to find. They are out on the range, in the cottonwoods that have grown back, and in the unmarked graves of the cowboys and homesteaders who were buried where they fell. The land remembers, the grass grows back. The cottonwoods eventually put on new bark. The descendants of the men who stood the country and stayed are still there. They are still ranching on some of the same ground. They are still telling the same stories about what happened and what it cost. And the wind on the Powder River still comes down off the bighorns the way it came down that winter. The same wind on the same country with the same final patience. You can stand out there in February today and feel exactly what those cows felt. That is the part of the history that has not changed at all. If this story moved you, leave a like so others can find it. Thanks for spending time with Western Pioneer Archives.